Hello, and thank you for coming this evening, and welcome to our first of our RVW 150th anniversary concerts. This is the first of a series, as many of you are probably aware, that goes on throughout the year, finishing in November, and we have visits by the Britten Symphonia, the Sitgevesti Trio, concerts by students from the school, past students such as Henry, who will be playing with us later on this evening. All the details are available on the school website, or you can pick up a flyer at the end of the recital if you have not yet done so. Anyway, that's the advert. Now for my nonsense, which I will keep brief. Now, this is not the first time I've made this confession in public before, but it feels especially wrong on this particular occasion to admit this. As an over-earnest and callow youth, I had very little time for Vaughan Williams. Compared to the music of his contemporaries, like Schoenberg and Stravinsky, it was sort of hard to suppress the feeling that this was a composer who was singularly out of touch with the direction that music was seen to be heading in the first half of the 20th century. To be honest, I was also put off by the manner in which his music was sort of commodified as part of a heritage industry that celebrated his supposed quintessential Englishness at the expense of any other aspect of his musical makeup. However, I freely admit, as I have done previously in public, that I was very wrong to think this. Frankly, I bought into the simplified notion that for music post-1900 to have any aesthetic worth, it must engage with avant-garde aesthetics, rather than develop new ways of working with pre-existing materials. This is as unfair to Vaughan Williams as it is wrong-headed about a composer like Schoenberg. I also assumed that the received image of Vaughan Williams, I say the image that I had received of Vaughan Williams anyway, as the very apex of Englishness, was all there was to his music. This was also an incorrect assumption. No music benefits from being heard only in one way, and there are so many interesting things we can discover in music when we bring it into contact with a variety of contexts. I believe this to be true of any music, let alone Vaughan Williams's. The first of Vaughan Williams's compositions that really opened my ears to his music were the larger scale pieces, and in particular his extraordinary Flos Campi for solo viola, wordless chorus and orchestra. Given its rather unique instrumentation, it possibly isn't performed as much as it should be, and if you don't know it or haven't listened to it recently, I would urge you to do so. It really is a fantastic piece. After catching some of the Vaughan Williams bug via Flos Campi, I tended to stick with the big pieces, launching myself into the symphonies. I don't believe it is an enormously controversial opinion today to suggest that these make as important a contribution to 20th century symphonic discourse as any other composer one may care to mention. Again, if you don't know the symphonies or haven't listened to them or aren't familiar with all of them, then give it a go. I can heartily recommend the Sixth Symphony, which I consider to be the best. It's an absolutely fascinating piece with one of the most extraordinary endings of any supposedly tonal piece you can possibly come across. However, lest one get the impression that only very big pieces for large forces really count, I would argue that there's a good deal in the smaller pieces, such as those heard this evening, that undermine this somewhat parochial image of Vaughan Williams and perhaps encourage us to listen to him slightly differently. The two violin pieces that we've just heard are a good example of this. They're thought to date from around 1914, just before the start of World War I, although they weren't published until 1923. If the assumed date of composition for these two pieces is accurate, then Vaughan Williams would have been working on them around the same time that he composed the original violin and piano version of his Lark Ascending, a piece which I'm sure everyone here is at least vaguely familiar with and has famously been voted the best piece of music in the world by Classic FM listeners on no less than 8 occasions. It is also possibly the piece that most people think of when considering the apparently one-note Englishness of Vaughan Williams, fairly or not. And I should just say at this point, I think it's a much more interesting piece than it has sometimes been made out to be. There are some similarities between the Lark and the pieces that we've just heard, such as the use of minor mode tonalities, some pentatonic touches, striking avoidance of traditional cadential formulas. These are all features of Vaughan Williams's music that anyone who's familiar with his music will understand. However, the Romance for Violin and Piano has a generally less bucolic feel, I would argue, than the Lark Ascending, which is also subtitled The Romance. So these are two pieces that, as far as we know, he was working on at the same time for the same forces. He gives them the same title, same as the viola piece we'll be hearing later on. Yet whereas Lark Ascending is this sort of quintessential Vaughan Williams sound, there's a lot about the Romance which is perhaps less usual for him. In fact, there's some harmonic resources in particular in that piece which we might find more familiar from the music of his French teacher, Maurice Ravel. And those of you who know me will find no surprise that I'm about to talk about Ravel. These less modal harmonic touches are not the only resonance with Vaughan Williams' teacher, in fact. The Romance is actually based on a simple rocking motif that we first hear in the piano at the opening. We hear throughout the piece. It's sort of this obsession almost. It's actually really quite similar to the opening motif of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, which also kind of lards itself throughout the whole ballet. Here's the Vaughan Williams motif. It's that rocking back and forth. And the opening of the Ravel is like this. It's even in the same key, and in fact actually has the same notes in. Now, I am not suggesting with any great conviction that this is anything other than entirely coincidental. It's a pretty simple idea anyway. But it is interesting to note that the UK premiere of Daphnis and Chloe, which had been premiered in France in 1912, was in June 1914 in London. So it is at least coeval with these pieces. So it's not necessarily out of the question that it could have been in the back of Vaughan Williams' mind. There are also, I think, some other reasons that we might link the two pieces together, or at least the two composers together, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, the main motive we just heard is contrasted with a more lyrical, modal, folk-like tune, which you hear kind of it's on the second page in the score. That's the whole of that tune. Now, interestingly, we hear those 11 bars, and then it returns immediately to the opening motif. And that doesn't come back for some time. Now, that's a very unusual thing to do compositionally in a piece. Normally, when we're teaching students to compose, we encourage them to use their material more efficiently, not just kind of, there's a tune, right, now I'm forgetting all about it and going back to what we did previously. Bear that in mind. Exactly the moment we hear that tune, something strange and actually rather dissimilar to the tune, which is very folk-like, happens in the accompaniment. And all of a sudden we start getting some very distinctly Ravelian harmonies, which are based on this scale. Now that's the acoustic scale. It's not a scale which you tend to come across much in the music of Vaughan Williams or in other British composers of the time. It is a scale that's very, very much associated with music on the continent, and Ravel in particular used it quite a lot, including in Daphnis and Chloe. Now, just to give you a taste of how he creates chords out of that, these are the things we're talking about, which you might remember from the performance just a second ago. It's that strange combination of those sort of whole tony sounds and then that lowered seventh there. It's a very, very distinctive sound, and it's unusual that all of a sudden occurs with this kind of quickly forgotten folk tune. Throughout that middle passage, the harmony keeps veering between the modality that we hear at the opening, and we associate more readily with Vaughan Williams, and these acoustic scale sonorities, whilst also touching on some really, really distant keys. It's a really fascinating moment, and there's an awful lot of modulation by thirds and stuff, which A-level students will know is very much associated with the 20th century, perhaps not so much with Vaughan Williams, though. That's also the moment that the folk song is just forgotten about. We hear 11 bars and then it's gone. It does come back later on, but for a long time, he just obsesses over this Daphnis-like motif, this Ravel-like motif. So we have this association of this kind of Ravelian harmony with a kind of almost a kind of a rejection, a forgetting, a binning of that folk-like thing. Now, following a climax that sees the violin ascending into the stratosphere, which is again a kind of rather Lark Ascending type moment perhaps, we have a repeat of the opening music. Now, for most people, what that would cue us into thinking is we're now going to get a movement towards the end. We've had the first section, we've had the contrasting middle section, although still using the same theme, and now we've got a repeat of the beginning, we're about to finish. That's not quite what he does, although that is what he does in the Pastoral, and it is what he does in the Viola Romance, we're going to hear later on. So this is unusual in that respect. What we get instead is a return of that briefly heard folk melody, which now we hear much more of. So that kind of melody which had been discarded rather abruptly, all of a sudden returns and is developed a little more and actually put into a slightly more modal context. There's still a few other kind of harmonies around, but a much more kind of expected sound world accompanies it at that point. That's not the end though. It's not even that he does a sort of A-B type thing with the folk melody acting as a sort of a strange kind of vestigial B section. He actually finishes it with a pentatonic sound. So pentatonic scales are 5-note scales that sort of sound, which is the basis of all sorts of music from around the world. It's very much associated with folk music in Europe. And that's how he finishes the piece, on a pentatonic scale. Now, there are fragments of pentatonicism earlier on, but this we have not heard before. So we actually finish on something which doesn't belong, if you like, to the movement we've just been listening to. We could, however, understand that pastoral ending to the Romance as setting the scene for the next piece, because the next piece opens, that's the Pastoral, opens with a much more kind of bucolic sound world, with a pentatonic melody in the violin. You might also hear the rocking piano accompaniment underneath that tune. In other words, that motif from the opening of the previous piece, the one I said was reminiscent of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, but now it's an accompaniment. It's suffered quite a severe change in status, we might say, from its position as the idée fixe in the first piece that kind of the music obsessed itself over, and now it's just an accompaniment. There is another link with the Romance, though, in the Pastoral, in the way that it's a much more, as I said, it's a much more stably modal sound world, but every so often we get kind of little kind of bits of spice added in. Like that chord, there's an augmented triad. Again, the sort of sounds that one much more readily associates with music on the continent, perhaps, and it feels a bit out of place. I mean, in a very well-judged way, but they kind of have these eruptions up from underneath the surface of these kind of slightly more dissonant chords, which perhaps are not the ones we would expect, given the context. So these two pieces, I think, make a really intriguing pair. I mean, they almost appear to reflect each other, because we've got in the Romance, we've got this obsession over this motif that's, I'm suggesting, is reminiscent of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, which then in the Pastoral is downgraded into an accompaniment. It's all, it's up there in the Romance, it's down there in the Pastoral. The folk-like tune of the Romance is swiftly abandoned after only 11 bars, and then we don't hear it for quite a lot of the piece. Whereas the Pastoral spends most of its time in this kind of bucolic atmosphere, but with occasional dissonant augmented triads unsettling its folk-like ambience. So whereas the Romance is kind of more Ravel, if you like, with a reduced content of folkness, the Pastoral reverses that with a much more folky atmosphere, but with occasional eruptions of a more Ravelian type idea, maybe. We've also got the pentatonic ending of the Romance, which seems to come out of nowhere. It seems completely unmotivated. Again, it's the sort of thing that if you were helping a student with composition, you tell them not to do that. Why have you got this new idea coming right at the end? That's ridiculous. Now, actually, it does link in very nicely to the Pastoral that comes next. But also, in the Pastoral, we get what you should have, where the pentatonic melody comes back at the end to close off the piece, creating that nice arch structure that we don't really have in the Romance. Now, Vaughan Williams very famously contended in regard to his enigmatic Sixth Symphony that I do not believe in meanings. However, The curious pairing of features in these two pieces does lead one to ponder what significance we might read into this music, or at least it leads me to ponder. If one were to consider the piece from a Freudian perspective, perhaps, one might hear an attempt to sublimate the influence of his teacher, represented by the Daphnis-like Ide Fix, in both the way that the folksy materials appear out of nowhere at the conclusion of the romance, sort of almost as if actually all of that's not real, this is the reality, and in the way that theme, which is so important in the romance, is kind of forced down underneath in the pastoral. Now, if that's the case, then we might hear a Freudian return of the repressed, represented by some of the dissonant harmonic features that occasionally rise to the surface in the pastoral. If so, Vaughan Williams would certainly not be the first composer to suffer from anxiety of influence. Now, whatever you might make of my this is deliberately cheeky reading of these pieces, and to be clear, I'm not making any claims to any insight into any authorial meaning, intended or subconscious. My real point is to try and help us understand that these are actually rich musical texts that engage with, rather than ignore, what was going on musically outside the UK. Also, and I think this is another really crucial point, it's not just the so-called major works, like the symphonies, that we can find evidence of why we should be celebrating Vaughan Williams' music this year. Even these little, apparently unassuming, salon-like pieces, such as these two, we have just heard provide more than enough material, I would suggest, to justify why we might want to spend a little extra time with the composer's music in the year of his 150th anniversary. Indeed, they might also suggest some of the interesting and surprising ways that we can hear his music, some of the new stories it might tell us, when we place it in a wider context. I hope you enjoy the rest of the concert.